about how he found red discoloration when he cut open into the back of his head towards the occipital bone, and he saw the red discoloration, and we actually saw the pictures of it. It's significant. You can't help but notice, why is this dark red here in the back of his head? And so he was important to note that.
They buried their son without knowing how he died. Not because no one looked, because 2 doctors looked. And what they found didn't match. One recorded an area of discoloration on the back of his head that the first examination had never fully explained. The other had kept pieces of his throat, his hyoid bone, his trachea, his laryngeal cartilage, and never sent them. 2 credentialed experts. 2 separate reports. 2 rooms, hundreds of miles apart. And both landed on the same word: undetermined. This is the case of Nolan Xavier Wells. And the body is only the beginning of what doesn't add up. If you want to follow this case as it develops, hit like and subscribe to Crime Dive Network now, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old, a wide receiver for Southwest Mississippi Community College. The kind of young man who smiled before he spoke, who filled every room he entered, who checked on the people he loved without being asked. To his parents, Christine and Elmore, he was a son who joked even in the middle of stress, who never let a day pass without making sure the people around him felt seen. On the morning of July 4th, he woke up in their home like it was any other holiday. He cooked dinner for his family that afternoon. His last words to his mother were simple. He told her he loved her. Then he left for Horn Island. It was a short boat ride to a barrier island off the Mississippi Gulf Coast, a place where thousands spent the holiday every year. Sunlight, music, water stretching in every direction. Nothing about that morning suggested it would be the last time his family would speak to him alive. He traveled with a group of friends, young men he had known since high school. By their account, they were family in every sense but blood. But the boat began taking on water. A call went out to sea tow. GPS data would later confirm the vessel left Horn Island at 4:31 in the afternoon and arrived at Fort Bayou just before 6. By then, Nolan was no longer on it. His friends told investigators he had chosen to stay behind on the island with an unknown female, that he planned to return with another group. His parents would later say that didn't sound like their son, that Nolan didn't separate from his people, that something about that decision didn't fit the boy they raised. The first call reporting him missing came from one of those friends around 11 o'clock that night. It went to the Coast Guard. Not long after midnight, Christine called the Jackson County Sheriff's Office herself. What followed was a search that spanned agencies, volunteers, and private citizens. The Coast Guard, the National Park Service, the Civil Air Patrol, the United Cajun Navy. Nolan's own father and football coach searched the island while drones failed in the heat, batteries swelling, software glitching in the July sun. For 2 days, a family held on to hope by the thinnest thread. Then, on the morning of July 6th, a U.S. Park Service ranger found Nolan's body in the water near the island's northwestern shoreline. And in that instant, grief without explanation became the only thing they had left. The first autopsy took place on July 7th at the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office. It followed the standard process. A body recovered, a body identified, a body examined by the office with jurisdiction over where it was found. On paper, nothing was unusual. But Christine and Elmore say that in those early days, they didn't feel like they were being told the full picture. They didn't feel like the questions they were asking were being met with the same urgency they were living through every hour. So in the middle of unimaginable loss, they made a decision most parents never have to consider. They chose not to wait on a system to give them answers. They chose to seek out a second, independent examination, no matter what it took. 3 days later, on July 10th, Nolan's body arrived in Washington, D.C., nearly 300 miles from where he was found. The examination was requested and paid for by his own family. The doctor they chose was Roger Mitchell, the former chief medical examiner for the District of Columbia and the sitting president of the National Medical Association. He had no prior connection to Mississippi law enforcement and no obligation to align his conclusions with anyone else's. For a family desperate for honesty, that independence mattered more than almost anything else. By the time Dr. Mitchell began his work, nearly a week had passed since Nolan was found. The body had already been through one complete examination, had traveled hundreds of miles, and had continued to change with each passing day, the way anybody does under those conditions. 2 doctors, 2 rooms, 2 very different starting points. And somewhere inside that gap sat a family still trying to plan a funeral and search for truth at the exact same time. The first notable finding in Dr. Mitchell's report involved the back of Nolan's head, where he documented an area of red discoloration in the deep soft tissue overlying the occipital bone. He did not call it proof of injury. He recorded it plainly as an unexplained observation, without drawing a conclusion either way. But once that finding became public, it split forensic professionals almost immediately. Some pathologists who reviewed the documentation said the discoloration was consistent with natural post-mortem changes. Others said it was equally possible it reflected an earlier injury to that area, something that may have happened before Nolan ever entered the water. 2 independent, credentialed experts. The same finding. 2 conclusions in direct opposition. Then came the second finding, and this one was harder to sit with. When Nolan's body arrived in Washington, certain internal structures from his neck were not included. His trachea, his hyoid bone, cartilage from his larynx. These had been retained by the Mississippi Medical Examiner's Office during the first autopsy and were not sent along with the rest of the remains. Multiple outside forensic pathologists have said that holding on to specific material for closer study is not by itself unusual. It is a standard accepted practice, but Dr. Mitchell was direct about what that absence meant for his own examination. Without those structures in front of him, he could not complete a full assessment of Nolan's neck. He could not rule out a certain category of injury connected to that area, and he could not confirm one either. His report states this as a limitation of his examination, not an accusation against anyone. 2 things are true at the same time. Holding on to material for further testing is standard forensic practice, and that same standard practice is the direct reason this case still doesn't have an answer. Both reports, written independently by 2 different doctors in 2 different states days apart, arrived at nearly identical conclusions. Manner of death undetermined. Cause of death undetermined. Pending further investigation. Not undetermined because someone is withholding the truth. Undetermined because, based on everything examined so far, that is precisely where the science currently stands. But for a family that has already said goodbye once, hearing that same word echoed back from 2 different cities, from 2 different doctors, is its own particular kind of heartbreak. It means the wait isn't over. It means the questions they've carried since the 4th of July are still theirs to carry, with no end date attached. But the body isn't the only place where this case comes apart. Among every account given in the weeks following Nolan's disappearance, one stands apart, not because it revealed new facts about what happened on the water, but because of what it revealed almost by accident about the people who were with him. It came from a long-form interview posted to a podcast with a large and politically engaged audience. The young man being interviewed introduced himself as one of Nolan's closest friends. He called Nolan a brother. He described a friend group that had known each other since high school, spending nearly every day together. For the opening minutes, viewers heard exactly what they expected. Loyalty, closeness, grief from someone who said he lost family. Then the host asked a simple question. Had he ever been to Nolan's house? He hadn't. He explained that it had always been Nolan coming to him, never the other way around. The follow-up questions kept pulling at that thread. Did Nolan's mother know who he was? He couldn't say with any certainty. Had he ever met her? He wasn't sure of that either. For someone who had just described Nolan as a brother, someone he said had grown up beside him for years, the absence of any real connection to Nolan's household, his mother, his home, stood out in a way that was difficult to ignore. That contradiction reached Nolan's mother directly. Her response was clear, and it carried a weight that no amount of online debate could soften. Not long after that interview started spreading, federal investigators stepped into a case that until then had belonged to one small coastal county alone. The FBI confirmed it was assisting the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, examining digital evidence from multiple boats, analyzing GPS data, and looking into cell phone forensics. The agency also stated it was working to address interstate threats received by individuals connected to the matter. Horn Island is federal land, which makes FBI involvement procedurally standard. But the timing raised questions that no one could ignore. A family still searching for answers, a friend group under increasing scrutiny, and a body that had already been examined twice, yet still refused to give up its secrets. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old. He told his mother he loved her on the last morning she saw him alive. 2 doctors have looked at what happened to him. A federal agency is looking now, and still, the only word that fits is undetermined. But undetermined is not the same as unknowable, and somewhere between a Mississippi coastline and a room in Washington, D.C., the truth about what happened to Nolan Wells is still waiting to be found. She drove through the dark to a house full of young men who called her son their brother, and when Christine Wansley arrived, she realized she didn't recognize most of their faces. These were the people who had spent the day with Nolan Wells on Horn Island, the ones who would later sit in front of a microphone and describe a friendship so deep it bled into family. But when Nolan's mother looked at the names connected to her son's final hours, she searched her memory and came up empty. Not close friends, not regular guests in her home. Strangers describing themselves as brothers to a boy whose mother had never set eyes on them. That was the night of July 4th, hours after Nolan disappeared. And the people who claimed to love him most hadn't yet thought to ask where he was. If you're following this case, hit like and subscribe to Crime Dive Network now, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next update. The interview that would change everything came weeks later. A young man who had been on that boat sat in front of a camera and called Nolan his brother. He described a group that had known each other since high school, spending nearly every day together. Family in every sense, but blood. Then the host asked a simple question. Had he ever been to Nolan's house? He hadn't. It had always been Nolan coming to him. Did Nolan's mother know who he was? He couldn't say. For someone claiming brotherhood, the absence of any real connection to Nolan's home, his mother, his life outside that group, opened a crack that would not close. That crack became a chasm once the true scale of that day came into focus. Early coverage suggested a small outing, 4 or 5 people, easy to track. It wasn't. Independent reporting later confirmed the gathering on Horn Island involved 3 boats and close to 200 people, part of a wider social circle, where many knew Nolan far less closely than the language of brotherhood implied. This was not an intimate afternoon among lifelong friends. It was a sprawling crowd on federal land, where a single young man could slip out of sight without anyone fully realizing it until it was far too late. Nolan's mother addressed the fallout with a restraint that said more than outrage ever could. She said she hadn't been following every piece of coverage, consumed instead by grief and funeral arrangements, simply trying to survive each hour. She hadn't known the interview existed until others told her, and when she finally learned of it, her response wasn't anger. She said she wanted to see it eventually, but only alongside her family's trusted point of contact, someone who had stood beside her since the earliest hours of the search. None of this proves wrongdoing, but it exposes a contradiction nobody has fully explained. A grieving mother holding her family together in public, while private questions about the people her son called friends remain unanswered. Before the investigation could move forward, it had to cut through the noise. Start with the delay before the alarm was raised. According to the timeline pieced together from those who were there, it was not one of Nolan's friends who first noticed something was wrong. It was his mother, reaching out that night after growing concerned when she hadn't heard from her son, arriving at his friend's door before any of them had raised concern of their own. That gap between her fear and their silence is documented. It is not speculation. It is simply what the record shows. Then there is the matter of Nolan's phone, a detail that generated intense speculation across social media for weeks. Online, it became a story about data being altered, about a device changing hands in ways nobody could explain. What actually happened is more procedural than the online narrative suggested. Both families agreed to a mutual inspection of the phone through a neutral third-party process, with experts representing both sides present. As of now, this stands as a resolved step in an active investigation, not an open accusation. It doesn't erase every question, but it shows both sides choosing transparency over silence, at least on this front. Another claim spread just as widely, and yet deserves more scrutiny. According to one on-air account, a canine unit was reportedly offered to examine one of the boats involved that day, and the offer was said to have been declined by representatives connected to the family's legal team. This claim comes from a single source. It has not been confirmed by law enforcement, by any filing, or by any other party connected to the case. Until that changes, it belongs in this story as exactly what it is, unverified, not an established fact. By mid-July, a name few expected to see attached to this case began appearing in local reporting, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, for a case that had, until then, remained in the hands of one county sheriff's office. That development sent speculation into overdrive. Online, the reaction was immediate and badly misinformed. Federal agents, stepping into a small coastal county on a case local law enforcement had described in its earliest hours as an accident. To a public already deeply suspicious, the FBI's arrival looked like confirmation that something far more serious was unfolding. The actual explanation is narrower than the speculation suggested, though no less significant. According to the agency's own statement, the FBI's involvement centers on two specific responsibilities. The first is assisting local investigators with the forensic examination of digital evidence already collected, work that requires specialized tools not every local department has in-house. Horn Island sits on federal land, giving the FBI a built-in jurisdictional connection that existed long before any controversy did. The second responsibility is separate and serious in its own right. The FBI confirmed it is actively investigating interstate threats made against individuals connected to this case. One of Nolan's friends said publicly that he and others had been receiving direct threats online since the case first gained national attention. He said plainly that he didn't understand the volume of hostility being directed at people simply trying to answer questions honestly. That danger wasn't limited to Nolan's immediate friend group. A sitting Mississippi judge, whose stepson was one of the young men aboard that boat, revealed publicly that her own family had received a wave of death threats following the case's escalation online. In a written statement, she said the threats would not stop the truth from coming out, and she emphasized that her family remained fully willing to cooperate with Nolan's family and their legal team, sharing everything they knew in the hope that both families could arrive at the answers they were searching for. Two families on opposite sides of unbearable suspicion, both saying in their own way that they simply want the truth. Both living under public anger, neither of them asked for. Both trying to protect their children while a case with no resolution plays out in front of millions of strangers. So yes, The federal government is involved in this case. That much is confirmed and isn't in dispute. But it's involved for reasons distinct from what much of online commentary has assumed. This is not, at this stage, a declared federal homicide investigation, and nothing in the FBI's own statement suggests that it is. What it actually represents is digital forensic support layered on top of a separate effort to protect people on multiple sides of this case, from threats that had escalated beyond what any local department could safely manage. Getting that distinction right matters, not to diminish the FBI's presence, but because misunderstanding why they're here has already fueled a version of this case that isn't grounded in anything actually confirmed. Which brings us to where this case genuinely stands today. The state's full findings, including toxicology results, remain outstanding weeks after Nolan's body was recovered. Both autopsy reports list manner and cause of death as undetermined, pending further investigation. That word has not changed since either report was filed. No charges have been brought against anyone connected to this case. No official determination of foul play has been made in either direction, not confirming it and not ruling it out. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office has confirmed the investigation remains open and active, with detectives continuing to work through digital evidence, witness interviews, and outstanding forensic results. For Nolan's family, none of that offers anything resembling closure. What it offers instead is a continued and exhausting wait stretched across weeks that were never supposed to unfold this way. Weeks that began with a holiday on the water and have not yet ended with an answer. His mother has said in her own words that all she and her family are asking for is honesty. Whatever that honesty ultimately reveals. Not a specific outcome, not a particular villain, just honesty. That request remains unanswered tonight, just as it has every night since his body was found along that shoreline. Somewhere in Mississippi, a family is still setting a place at the table for a young man who should be there. Somewhere in that same state, an investigation continues slowly, carefully, without any promise of when it will end. If you want this case followed closely with every new development as it's confirmed, subscribe to Crime Dive Network and turn on notifications now. And tell me in the comments, out of everything covered so far, what's the one detail that still doesn't add up for you?